எப்படியோ அருள்வாய், எப்படியோ அருள்வாய், அது எவ்விதம் நான் அறிவேன். இப்படி அப்படி என்று உன்னை ஏற்பது வீணல்லவோ. எப்படியோ அருள்வாய், அது எவ்விதம் நான் அறிவேன். இப்படி அப்படி என்று உன்னை ஏற்பது வீணல்லவோ.
Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Arunachala Ramanaya.
You can also use video, if possible. Convenient.
Today I'm going to be talking about the path of self-surrender as taught by Bhagavan. In all bhakti traditions, the aim of all bhakti traditions is to surrender oneself to God. But it is never very clearly explained what exactly is self-surrender. That is two main ideas people have about surrender. Firstly, we have to surrender our will to God. And secondly, we have to dedicate ourselves to the service of God. Regarding service to God, many bhakti traditions acknowledge that God doesn't actually need our service, but for our benefit we serve God. Serving God usually means worshipping Him in some way. What is real service to God has been defined by Bhagavan in verse 29 of Upadesha Undiya. What he says in verse 29 is, this is quite different to the usual idea people have of service to God. What Bhagavan says in verse 29 is, Bandhavidatra parasukha mutrava indanilai nitral undipara irepani nitralam undipara. What that means is, standing in this state, thereby experiencing supreme bliss, which is devoid of bondage and liberation, is standing in the service of God. When he says Inda Nilay Nitral, standing in this state, he's referring to the previous verse in which he explained the result of knowing ourselves. What he says in the previous verse is, Tanadu il yadu ena tan teri hil pin anadi ananta sat undipara akanda chidananda undipara. What that means is, if one knows what the nature of oneself is, then beginningless, endless, unbroken being, awareness, happiness, sat chidananda. That is anadi, ananta, akanda, Satchidananda. When we know ourselves, what remains is just Anadi, Ananta, Akanda, Satchidananda. So being in this state, thereby experiencing supreme bliss, which is devoid of bondage and liberation, is standing in the service of God. That is why he says devoid of bondage and liberation is, now we seem to be in bondage, so we are seeking liberation. But when we actually attain liberation, we will find that bondage was, that we have been eternally liberated. And bondage is therefore unreal. So in that, when we know ourselves as we actually are, we go beyond the pair of opposites, the dvandva of bondage and liberation. We just remain as we always are, thereby experiencing parasukham. This, Bhagavan says, this is irepani nitra. This is abiding or standing in the service of God. So true service of God is nothing but subsiding back into the heart and remaining as we actually are by knowing ourselves. The other idea people have about surrender is that to surrender to God, we must surrender our will. Thy will be done. That is not our will, it's God's will. As Bhagavan put it in verse 2 of Arunachala Patikam, Ninishtam Enishtam Imbadaku. That means your ishtam, your will, your wish is my wish. That is happiness for me. So whatever you wish, that I don't wish anything other than what you wish. That is happiness for me. So surrendering our will to God is the aim. It's generally understood as the aim in the path of surrender. But though we can surrender our will to a certain extent, we can reduce the intensity of our likes, dislikes, desires, attachments, hopes, fears, and so on. We can do so to some extent. But there's a limit to how much we can do so, because so long as we rise as ego, the very nature of ego is to have likes, dislikes, desires, attachments. In other words, to have Vishaya Vasana. So we cannot be totally free of Vishaya Vasana without being free of ego. So real surrender is not just surrender of our will. Surrender of our will is absolutely necessary, because so long as we have strong desires and attachments, we won't be willing to surrender ourselves. So surrendering our will is a necessary part of the process. But ultimately, we can surrender our will completely and thereby truly abide in the service of God only by surrendering ego. So that is why it is called Atma Samapanam, self-surrender. The Atma or self we have to surrender is this ego. We obviously cannot surrender what we actually are. We can only surrender this false seeming self called ego. So that is what the aim, the ultimate aim in self-surrender. So how to surrender ourselves? Bhagavan has made this clear in a way that, as far as I'm aware, has not been made so clear in any of the old ancient sastras or in any ancient revelation. What Bhagavan has made clear is what is the nature of ego. That is, as Bhagavan made clear, the nature of ego cannot rise, stand, or flourish without constantly grasping form, as he put it in verse 25 of Uludunapatu. Grasping form, ego itself is a formless demon. He describes it as Ulupatra Pei Ahande, formless ego, the formless demon ego. So it's formless because it's got no form of its own. So without any form, it's got no separate existence. So it seems to have a separate existence only by grasping form. So ego cannot rise, cannot stand, cannot endure, and cannot flourish without constantly grasping form. That means, firstly, the first form we grasp is the form of a body, but we take as I. And then we constantly, our attention, our mind is going outwards, constantly attending to things other than ourselves. Everything other than ourselves is a form. So attending to things other than ourselves is grasping form. So this is the very nature of ego. And because we cannot rise, stand, or flourish without grasping form is the very nature of ego. And grasping form, because we have because we cannot exist as ego without grasping form, we have what are called Vishaya Vasana, the strong inclination to attend to Vishayas. Vishayas are all forms. So attending to forms is the very nature of ego, and having desire to attend to forms is the nature of ego. So by attending to anything other than ourselves, we cannot surrender ourselves. We as ego cannot subside. But merely stopping attending to other things is not a solution, because every night when we fall asleep, we stop attending to other things. So in order to annihilate ego, the only way is to attend to ourselves. As Bhagavan implies in that verse 25 of Uludanabdi, he says, Tedinal otum pidikam. That means if sought, it takes flight. That is, so long as we're attending to other things, we are feeding and nourishing ego. If we attend to ourselves, ego takes flight. That means it runs away. That's a metaphorical way of saying ego subsides and dissolves back into its source. Since such is the nature of ego, the only way to surrender ourselves is to attend to ourselves. The more we attend to ourselves, the more we will thereby subside. And subsidence of ego is the pinnacle of surrender. It's what surrender ultimately is. All the trying to surrender our will is all a part of the process. But the aim of the process, the aim of self-surrender, is the complete subsidence of ego. Therefore, in the 13th paragraph of Nan Yar, Bhagavan, in the first sentence, Bhagavan defines what it means to give ourselves to God. What he says in this first sentence is, Anma chintane tavira, vera chintane kalambavataku, tatram idum kodamal, atmanishta paranai irpade, tanne isanaku alipadam. That means being as Atmanishtaparam. Atmanishtaparam means one who is firmly fixed as oneself. In other words, Atmanishtaparanai irupte, that means being as we actually are. In other words, being without rising as ego. That is giving ourselves to God. That's the main clause. So how can we be without rising as ego? That he indicates in the adverbial clause, which comes at the beginning. That is, Atma chintane tavira, vera chintane kalambavataku satram idam kadamo. That means not giving even the slightest room to the rising of any thought other than Atma chintana. Atma chintana literally means thought of oneself. But it clearly implies self-attention. Being self-attentive, that is, we need to be so keenly self-attentive that we thereby give no room for the rising of any other thoughts. Thoughts cannot rise without our attending to them. So if our whole attention is fixed on ourselves, there will be no room for any other thoughts to arise. So what Bhagavan implies in this sentence is we need to be so keenly self-attentive that we thereby give no room to the rising of any thought. When other thoughts subside, ego will also subside, and thereby we remain as Atmanishtaparam. We remain firmly fixed in ourselves, and that is giving ourselves to God. So, though Bhagavan sometimes talked about two paths, Atma Vichara and Atma Samapanam, self-investigation and self-surrender, here he makes it very clear that ultimately the surrender can be complete only by Atma Vichara. So Atma Vichara and Atma Samapanam, ultimately they're the same path. Atma Samapanam may begin with devotion to an external form of God, but that devotion to the external form of God, that matures into that is the ultimate form of bhakti is to give ourselves, is to attend to nothing other than ourselves, as Bhagavan indicates in verses 8 and 9 of Upadesha Undiyar. In verse 8 he says, Anya bhavatin avanahamahum ananya bhavamai undipara anatinam utamum undipara. That means rather than anya bhava, meditating on God as if he was something other than ourselves, ananya bhava, meditating on him as nothing other than ourselves, with the understanding that avanaham, he is I, that is anatinam utamam, that is the best among all. So among all the practices of bhakti, the best is to attend to nothing other than ourselves. In other words, to be self-attentive. So what he refers to there as ananya bhava is just another way of describing what he calls here atmachintana, what he otherwise calls atmavichara. So attending to nothing other than ourselves, with the understanding that God is what is shining in us as I, that is the best of all forms of bhakti. And then in the next verse, he says, Bhava balatinal bhavanatita tat bhava tu iritale undipara parabhakti tattvam undipara. That is by the strength of bhava, by the strength of the meditation, that implies by the strength of the ananya bhava, by the strength of the self-attentiveness, being in Sat-bhava. Sat-bhava means the state of being, our natural state of just being as we are. So being in Sat-bhava, which transcends bhavana. Bhavana there implies meditation in the form of mental activity. Because as I explained earlier, when we attend to ourselves, attending to anything other than ourselves is a mental activity. Attending to ourselves is the subsidence of all mental activity. Because when we attend to ourselves, ego subsides, and when ego subsides, its activity also subsides. So by the strength of self-attentiveness, we subside and remain in the state of being which transcends all mental activity. And that, Bhagavan says, is parabhakti tattva. That is the very nature of supreme devotion. So the pinnacle of the path of devotion is subsiding and being as we actually are. That is complete self-surrender. And the means for that is self-attentiveness. So in this 13th paragraph, he goes on to, this is such an important paragraph, the 13th paragraph of Nana. After defining what is giving ourselves to God, we may naturally think, oh, if I attend only to myself without thinking of anything else, then I have so many other responsibilities. How will I take care of my family? How will I take care of myself? How will all these things? Bhagavan gives us an assurance in the next sentence. Isam peril evlo bharate potalum avvalevayum ava vahitu kolukira. It means however much burden one places on God, he will bear all of it. So the implication in this context is we can even the burden of thinking we can leave to God. So we need not think about anything other than ourselves. Anything else that needs to be thought about, we can leave that burden to God. So God will take care of everything if we surrender ourselves completely by holding firmly to self-attentiveness and not giving the slightest room to the rising of any other thought. And then in the next sentence, he continues to explain this in more detail. He says, Sakala Karyangalayam Oru Parameshwara Shakti Nadati Kondu Kirapadiyal Namum Adaku Adangi Ramal Ipadi Vendum Endru Sada Chintipad Bain. That means when since that one Parameshwara Shakti that supreme ruling power, that is the power of God, the power of grace, since that is driving all karyas. When he says it's driving all karyas, that means it's making everything that needs to happen is happening by that. Everything that we need to do, he will make us do. So that when I say we do, that means our mind, speech, and body, whatever they need to do, they'll be made to do. We just need to hold on to self-attentiveness. So when he says, since that one Parameshwara Shakti is driving all karyas, why should we, instead of yielding ourselves to that, be constantly thinking it's necessary to do like this, it's necessary to do like that? Ipadi sevendam, apadi sevendam. Why should we be constantly thinking that instead of just yielding ourselves to that power, leaving everything to that power of that one Parameshwara Shakti? And then he illustrates this with the beautiful analogy of a passenger, a very apt analogy of a passenger traveling on a train. When we're traveling on a train, we know the train is carrying all the burden. So why should we suffer carrying our small luggage on our head instead of putting it aside and letting the train carry it? That is, whether we carry the luggage on our head or put it on the seat beside us or under the seat or on the luggage rack, it's all being carried by the train. So why should we suffer carrying it on our head instead of putting the luggage on the train and being at ease? Sukamai iramo. That instead of being comfortable, of being happy, why should we carry the burden of this world on our head? So thinking about anything other than ourselves is carrying our luggage on our head. Whereas thinking about nothing other than ourselves, attending only to ourselves, and thereby giving ourselves wholly to God, wholly to Bhagavan, that is surrendering ourselves. So Bhagavan has made it very, very clear what is complete self-surrender. So Bhagavan's path is not just the path of jnana, it is the path of bhakti. The path of bhakti and the path of jnana, ultimately they're not two different paths. At the start they may seem to be different paths, but ultimately they merge together in the state of complete self-surrender. So Bhagavan's path is the supreme path of bhakti, the ultimate path of bhakti, the path of giving ourselves wholly to God by subsiding back into the heart. Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Arunachala Ramanaya. So I hope that was clear. Do you hear me?
Yes. Thank you very much, sir. With humble gratitude, we thank for your presence, your honored presence in our platform today, and giving us how to surrender oneself to Bhagavan. I would just like to ask, anybody has any questions? Just give it. ఎవరికైనా ప్రశ్నలు ఉంటే మీరు హ్యాండ్ రైజ్ చేయొచ్చండి. ఎనీ ఆఫ్ యూ హ్యావ్ క్వశ్చన్స్ ఫర్ వాంటెడ్ టు బి క్లారిఫైడ్ బై మైకేల్ జేమ్స్ గారు, యూ కెన్ raise your hands. I'll unmute you.
Thank you, Michael, for having come over here and giving a beautiful pravachanam or talk on surrender. It seems there is nobody who is asking some question or not. So we can proceed to the next program with your permission, sir.
Okay.
Just a minute.
Namo Ramanaya.
Malini Gari, what is Yeah,
Namaskaram.
Malini.
Namaskaram, Mr. Michael. Are you still here on the call?
Yes, I'm still here.
At the outset, on behalf of Ramana Satsang, on behalf of Sri Lavanya Rao and all the Satsangis, would like to thank you for this absolutely beautiful speak on surrender and how nicely and how in a simple way you took us to towards understanding the various paths. I wouldn't definitely call it the Hinduistic path, but the various paths which help us and perhaps not help us understand the term surrender. And as you said, சக்கல காரியங்களும் ஒரு பரமேஸ்வர சக்தியால நடந்துருக்கு. Everything is being determined by that one Parameshwara Shakti, and it is of course easy to say put all your burdens on that Shakti, and as Bhagavan said and as you said in your Pravachanam, Bhagavan says just unload your burden, he is ready to receive it all. And that's such a weighty yet a profound statement for all us to constantly carry it in our life's journey. And thank you once again for this very, very touching and endearing Pravachanam, and for your very, very beautiful words on Bhagavan's teachings. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
நீ அருள் புரிவாய் ராமண, நீ அருள் புரிவாய் ராமண, நீ அருள் புரிவாய் ரமண, அருணாச்சல மங்களம், அருணாச்சல சிவ மங்களம். நீ அவதாரா, நீ அவிச்சாரா, நீ அவதாரா, நீ அச்சல, நீ அருள் புரிவாய் ரமண, நீ அருள் புரிவாய் ரமண, அருணாச்சல மங்களம், அருணாச்சல சிவ மங்களம், அருணாச்சல 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 மங்களம்.